My Govanen Melunin, and well met indeed. I am Aragorn Galadirthan, the head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, but welcome back to the lore videos I often have on the channel. It's been a while since I've done a lore video, but I return to it now with the news, great news in my opinion, that there will be a Lord of the Rings TV series. And it gave me the idea to do a sort of mini-series, if you will, of character biographies. The Third Age interests me more than the First or Second Age, and it's the area that I know the most about, and it's the easiest for me to do the video, so I'm pleased I'm returning to the Third Age. And I'm going to start with, of course, Aragorn, who is going to be the focus of the mini-series, the TV series, whenever that comes out. The video itself, if you've never watched one of these lore videos, is intended very much as a podcast. I've never truly looked into podcasts, so here we are on YouTube, but there are images in the background, but it's not really intended to be watched. It's more of a listen thing. There's not really very much visual stimulation. Also, disclaimer for every video, the images on the screen, none of them were created by me, and unless they are just text. And if you have any qualms with any of the images that you see displayed here, contact me immediately and we can get it resolved. So, we can dive straight in then, without any further adoing or any return to the spiel. We shall start with Aragorn. Now, Aragorn, first off, we'll go deal with names. His name literally means revered king, or possibly valorous king, or king of valor. And this comes from the subparts Ara, which means king, or Ara, which means king, and Ngorn, which means valor, revered, zeal. Many suggested proffered solutions for the name, but the most commonly agreed upon translation is revered king. Which is a bit of foreshadowing from his parents, isn't it? Let's be honest. He is, however, known most commonly in various lands. In the Bree land, of course, he is known as Strider. Simply Strider. They have no idea of his lineage, no idea who he truly is. He's just a grave wanderer who comes in out of the wilds every now and then. And doesn't talk to many people, I presume. Bilbo knows him as the Dúnedain, which is the singular form of Dúnedain, which obviously just means the West man. Which is what Dúnedain means, Western men. In Imladris, and for a great deal of, or not a great deal, for about 10% of his life, he is actually known as Estelle. This is used as a cover so that people don't know his true identity. And of course, he is also often known as Elisar. Although he's never directly called Elisar, it is greatly woven into the fabric of Aragorn's being, and is a common pseudonym for him. So those are his names. He was born on the 1st of March in 2931 of the Third Age. His mother is Gilrain and his father is Arathorn II. However, upon the second year of his life, he's only 2 years old when his father is killed. He takes an arrow to the eye, which is an interesting way to die. Harold will tell you all about that. And he then moves to Imladris. This is where Elrond immediately gives him the name Estelle to ensure that nobody knows who he truly is, for fear of protecting the Dúnedain chieftain line. Of course, because Aragorn is, as far as we're aware, the only claimant to the throne of Arnor. And so if enemies were to find out who Aragorn truly was and he were to die as well, then hope for the free peoples would falter. Elrond also fosters Aragorn to some extent and becomes something of his, well, foster father. Which is, so they actually have a really, really close bond, which doesn't necessarily come across from, say, the film, for example. He spends the first sort of 19, 20 odd years of his life in Rivendell, and he gets obviously to know very much the twins. Unfortunately, a side note, apologies for the image that it's from a game. The images of the twins online is almost invariably anime, and then often doing things that you wouldn't want brothers to be doing. So I just settled on gaming. So Elladan and Elrohir, of course, the twin sons of Elrond. They are the brothers of Arwen, and they are already of age by the time Aragorn even comes to Elrond. But Elladan and Elrohir, he journeys with them a great deal in his youth, his teenage years. It doesn't really say, I should almost disclaim at this point, that Tolkien is not that descriptive of what Aragorn does in various places. So this may not go into as much detail as you're hoping, but I'll try and give you the best I can. But so he journeys around Eriador with Elladan and Elrohir, And he grows very quickly, he matures very quickly, which is something Elrond notes of him. He even says that he is early come to manhood. Of course, Aragorn is one of the Dúnedain. They have elongated lives. But by the time of the Third Age, their elongated lives are nowhere near what they were when they were full-blooded Númenóreans. So he comes early to manhood, which is good. But there's no suggestion at this time that he's going to live to be as old as he does live to be. Whereas a lot of his kindred and a lot of his brethren tend to live to about, at this kind of time, they tend to live to about 140, 150. So even though they have longer lives, the point I'm making is that they don't have ridiculous lives. They're not 600-700 years old before they die kind of thing. So anyways, by the time he's 20, he's fully matured, he's already a man, and Elrond feels confident in Aragorn's abilities to survive and defend himself. So at this point, at the age of 20, in the year 2951, Elrond comes to Estelle and he tells him who he truly is. For Aragorn has spent the first 20 years of his life named Estelle and not knowing that he is the chieftain of the Dúnedain. But at the age of 20, Elrond gives to him the Ring of Barahir and the Shards of Narsil as tokens of who he truly is. And he comes to know that he is Aragorn and he is the chieftain of the Dúnedain. However, at this same time, I'm fairly certain it's almost like the next day or something like that, Arwen is returning to her father from Lothlorien, because as many of you will know, Arwen's mother comes from Lothlorien, and her grandmother is Galadriel. So Arwen is returning from Lothlorien, and she comes back to Imladris, and Aragorn is singing through the woods, genuinely. He's singing and skipping through the woods as he's so pleased to learn who he is. And he chances upon Arwen in the woods, and as with many of Tolkien's stories, he instantly falls in love with her. Pretty much straight away. He is absolutely enamoured with her. And they spend some time together. Not very much, mind. We're talking months at best. They spend some months together, maybe even just days together. And he, obviously, as I say, falls head over heels. And he comes to Elrond. But Elrond, at this point, prophesies thus: "You shall neither have wife nor bind any woman to you in troth," which is old world speak for marriage, "until your time comes and you are found worthy of it." Elrond then sighs. After a while, looking gravely upon Aragorn, he says again, "The years will bring what they will, but we will speak no more of this until many have passed." So he doesn't directly say that you must be king before you can marry my daughter, but he does say you need to be worthy to marry my daughter, because Aragorn, after only knowing her for a few days, is already seeking her hand in marriage. So Aragorn then opts to go out alone. Elrond has basically set him a quest, really, if we're playing an RPG here. And he says, you're not going to marry her until you're worthy. So Aragorn thinks, well, the only way I'm going to be worthy is to get out there and do something. So off he goes. This all happens within the space, as I say, of a couple of months. He learns who he is. He gets the ring. He gets the shards. He meets Arwen, falls in love, wishes to marry her, gets told he can't, and then leaves. And this all happens in about 3 months or so. It's madness. Anyway, so he goes out into Eriador, and this is where he wanders alone for quite some time. For about sort of 5 or 6 years, he now ventures around Eriador, and this is where he gains the name Strider. This is when the Bree-landers come to know of him. This is all around the year 2956 of the Third Age, so we're still talking about 60-ish years before the events of the War of the Ring. That's where we are at the moment. So he wanders around Eriador, and in this 6 years of just defending the poor and weak people of Bree, which is what they are at this time, he also comes across Gandalf. Now, not much is said of their meeting at all, or indeed how much time they spend together, but we do know that they become very good friends. And Gandalf, of course, surely knows who Aragorn is. Aragorn must say, I'm Aragorn, and Gandalf will know who that is immediately. So Gandalf surely knows the importance that Aragorn has for the Free Peoples, and I imagine he kind of lends aid to Aragorn himself as well, to ensure that Estelle grows into something that they would want to be ruling the lands, if they can beat evils, of course. Basically what I'm getting at here is I think Gandalf and Elrond are in cahoots to make sure that Aragorn turns into a good person. Someone worthy of the high kingship of Gondor and Arnor. So, after 6 years of wandering in Eriador, becoming Strider, taking up the name, he then comes to the most, I think, interesting bit of Aragorn's life, and the bit that certainly, if there's a TV series, they will focus on massively. And this is when he takes up the name Thorongil. Now, I didn't put it at the beginning, but Thorongil means Eagle of the Star in Sindarin, and it's the name that Aragorn takes for himself when he then goes to Rohan and Gondor. So at the age of 26, he then comes to Rohan. He serves for quite a while in the army of King Thengel, but he uses different names, and he even uses disguises quite often to make sure no one knows who he is. But now, for a time, he fights in Rohan. He gets to know the Rohirrim. He gets to know the land of Rohan and their armies. But more importantly, and certainly for the story and for future events, he also comes into the service of Steward Ecthelion II, who is, of course, Denethor's father. Now, under the guise of Thorongil, and under his many guises, Aragorn does stupendously well in the service to Gondor. He swiftly becomes one of Ecthelion's greatest counsellors and military leaders. And remember, he's only... he's any age between the age of 26 and 49 at this point. He does spend around about 14 years with Rohan and with Gondor. But Ecthelion really reveres him. And this is where the point of intrigue comes, because Aragorn was born in 2931 and Denethor was born in 2930. He is 1 year Aragorn's senior. So when Aragorn arrives in Gondor, let's say he's about 28, possibly, maybe 30. Denethor is 30 as well, or 31. So they are obviously the same age, and Denethor sees this stranger from the wilds come into his court and gain his father's favour, and a deep envy grows. Denethor is very jealous of the power and the reverence that Aragorn commands from the peoples of Gondor and from Ecthelion. So much so that when Aragorn eventually actually leaves Gondor, it is written that Denethor is the only person in the kingdom who is not sad to see him go. But a little minor point on this is that it's never actually known whether Denethor discovers who Aragorn really is. So yes, Denethor is very envious of him, and he obviously is jealous, but there's no suggestion that he knows that this is Aragorn, the future High King. So that you can't necessarily link Denethor's denying of the return of the king in the later years with his envy of Aragorn now, because there's no suggestion that he knows who Aragorn is. Of course, Aragorn is called Thorongil to the Gondorians, and he came from Rohan. He didn't even come from the north. He almost certainly would have come with Gondorian clothing. So there's very little suggestion that they know who he is. But it is just worthwhile noting there's a lot of intrigue here as Aragorn rises through the court and Denethor envies him. But another little interesting side tidbit at this point is that while Aragorn is in service to Gondor, Boromir is actually born, as is Faramir, and so Aragorn would have actually known Boromir as a child, a proper child, a newborn child. Which makes, obviously, Boromir's death all the more heartfelt when Aragorn has actually seen this man grow to become a man. It's quite interesting, really, isn't it? They're quite interlinked. Oh, sorry, I didn't change the image. But the greatest achievement that Aragorn, or Thorongil, has whilst in service to Gondor is his raid of the Corsairs. He counsels Ecthelion that the raiders and pirates of Umbar are growing to become quite a threat to Gondor, and they need to be dealt with. Ecthelion eventually agrees that perhaps an attack should be mounted, and Aragorn is chosen to lead it. And he comes upon Umbar in the dead of night with quite a small fleet, and he is able to dish out a hell of a lot of destruction. It is even said as well that in the midst of the fighting, Aragorn and presumably some crewmen dismount on the quays of the dockyard of Umbar, where he slays the captain of the haven himself. So either the captain of just the haven or maybe the ruler of the city, it's not clear, but a very important member in the military structure of Umbar is slain by Aragorn's hand in one-on-one melee combat on the quays of Umbar, which is very, very interesting. But with this minor fleet, he sacks and destroys a huge proportion of the Umbar fleet, is all we know. We don't know exact numbers. But it is said that his attack here is so powerful that it has ripple effects right through to the War of the Ring when he then actually fully defeats Umbar himself, as we'll see in a moment. But he is instrumental in defending Gondor at this time and destroying the Umbar fleet, thus saving Gondor further down the line without even realising. However, then he takes a little bit of an interesting departure. For on his return to Gondor, he is now absolutely lauded. He's basically a national hero, but he chooses not to return to Minas Tirith. And instead, when the fleet returns to Gondor and it comes into Pelargir, which, if you're unaware, is Gondor's greatest port city, and the centre of its maritime affairs, he comes up to Pelargir where he disembarks, but he doesn't go to Minas Tirith. He then goes off on his own again. And he's 49 years of age now. Well, he's about 49 years of age. This is happening in 2980s. We're only now about 40 years before the War of the Ring. And at this time, he then actually goes to what, in inverted commas, he undertakes perils on the borders of Mordor. So after leaving the army at Pelargir and not returning to a hero's welcome at Minas Tirith, he goes to Mordor for no real reason, other than one can assume that he is already fearful of Sauron and he's already attempting to waylay Sauron's forces. So he goes to Mordor, and I can only assume he tries to maybe scout it out. He tries to disrupt anything that the Black Land is doing. He tries to just gather information. Who knows? But anyway, he goes to Mordor, and he spends a few months there on his own. But then he resolves that he's going to go, which we'll get to in a minute. But before he just goes into the east and the south, he then returns to Lothlorien, and it is here where he finally is betrothed to Arwen. Elrond hasn't necessarily given his blessing. Elrond isn't even around. But the two of them decide they are going to get married. So Aragorn returns to Lothlorien, where he meets Arwen again. She is again visiting her grandmother. And again, it's just a random chance that they bump into each other. He's just exploring the woods, and he again comes upon Arwen in the forest, and they spend quite a few days together, just the two of them. And then they do then decide to get married, as I say. And Aragorn gives the Ring of Barahir to Arwen as a token of their betrothal, which is a departure from the movie where Wormtongue recognises, or Saruman recognises who Aragorn is, because Wormtongue says he has this ring, which is depicted on the screen, the Ring of Barahir. Whereas in truth, Aragorn does not have the ring. He has given it to Arwen, and she uses it as a wedding ring, an engagement ring. But then comes Aragorn's second major event. So the first big event for Aragorn, I would submit, is his time fighting in Rohan and Gondor. And then the second major event, which is really quite interesting, but again we know nothing about, is that he then leaves for about 28 years. He goes into Rhûn and Harad. So I got the map up again for you, for those that don't know. So he's over in here in Lothlorien. You should be able to see the cursor, but if not, it's in the centre of the screen. And this is where he gets betrothed to Arwen. But then he just decides to up and leave and venture into the east in Rhûn and into the south in Harad. And he spends time here, and this is a direct quote from the books. He fought for the Lord of Gondor by land and by sea, and then in the hour of victory over the Corsairs, he passed out of the knowledge of the men of the West and went alone far into the east and deep into the south, exploring the hearts of men both evil and good, and uncovering the plots and devices of the servants of Sauron. So he goes alone as an agent into Rhûn and Harad, and he's just mad. So he goes there to explore the hearts of men, to understand men both evil and good, and he does actively try to uncover and waylay plots and devices of Sauron. So he's very aware of the threat that Sauron poses, even now. And remember, at this time, Sauron hasn't even openly declared himself to the world, so Aragorn's got quite a bit of forethought and foresight, perhaps because of his links with Elrond and Gandalf, who are both also actively aware and pursuing Sauron. So anyway, so he goes into the east and the south, and that is all we know. We do not know anything of his adventure at this time. It is a complete artistic license area, which is why I think it will be covered heavily in the TV series. But then at the age of 70, he finally returns, or 75, sorry. And we know this for one reason, because his mother dies. In the year 3006, 13 years before the War of the Ring, Gilraen dies. And she sees Aragorn one last time before she does, in the year before she passes away. So we know that in his 28 years of wandering, He does return every now and then, and we know he returns at least once, if not twice, because there is a suggestion that he returns to the borders of the Shire when he's in the year 3001, but nothing concrete. Anyway, he returns to Gilrain, and she says the famous words that many of you will know on the screen in Sindarin, which is Onen I Esteladin Uchebin Estel Anim, which means I gave hope to the Dúnedain and I kept no hope for myself, which is a direct link, of course, to Aragorn, whose name for much of his life was Hope. So she is essentially saying, I've given you to the Dúnedain, to the peoples of Númenor, to the future of Gondor and Arnor, and in so doing I've lost you myself. I would submit is a rough translation of what she means. She also says to Aragorn that this is our last parting, Estelle, my son. And then, as I say, she then passes away the next year. Gilrain dies when she is 100 years old. And there's nothing to suggest that she dies of grief or sickness or illness. She just dies. So that gives an indication that the long lives, as I say, are not as long as you might think. And then Aragorn gets embroiled in the start, the kind of the foothills of the War of the Ring, if you will, with the hunt for Gollum. Which, interestingly, is actually a standalone fan-made movie you can watch online. I've never watched it myself, but people always tell me to. So when Aragorn is about 78, he returns from his wanderings in the east and the south. Now, this is the year 3009, so we're only 10 years before the War of the Ring now. And this is when Gandalf and Aragorn both actively start searching for Gollum. Gandalf becomes suspicious of the ring after Bilbo uses it at his farewell party, which is in 3001. So 18 years before the War of the Ring, Bilbo does his, I know half as well of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. That happens 18 years before the War of the Ring, whereas the film makes you feel like it happens a couple of months before, so there's another departure. But anyway, Gandalf obviously is there to witness Bilbo's little stunt, and he becomes worried that his ring is the One Ring, because few rings offer invisibility on use. And this is when Gandalf obviously knows that Gollum had the ring before Bilbo, so he seeks him out to try and question him, and he gets Aragorn involved. So Aragorn and Gandalf begin searching for Gollum, and they take years and years to find him. It takes about 8 years to find Gollum in the end, but Aragorn eventually does. They spend most of their time looking around the Anduin, and then all the way down to Mordor. But he finds him. Aragorn comes upon him in the dead marshes. By sheer luck, again, he was almost giving up hope, really. He goes all the way to Minas Morgul looking for Gollum, and on his way returning north again to search somewhere else, he comes upon Gollum's fresh footprint in the marshes of the Dagorlad, and he follows him and captures him quite easily. He then covers the distance, which is quite amazing. He covers 900 miles in just 50 days, leading Gollum with him, who is obviously putting up a fight at every stage. And he brings Gollum all the way to Thranduil, and there he is imprisoned. But to get there, he crosses at the San Gebir, which is pretty much almost exactly where the Fellowship, well, where Frodo and Sam cross Nen Hithoil at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, where they cross the lake, where Boromir passes away. That area is where Aragorn and Gollum cross over the river using driftwood to get Gollum across. So he's very familiar with Gollum's waterman ways. And then they go up the western side of the Anduin, and then he crosses back over at the Carrock, which is a famous river crossing in the north of Middle-earth, where the Beornings hold sway. And it is even said that actually the Beornings help him across. So Aragorn is really, really well known to the world. Rohan know him, Gondor know him, Harad know him, Rhûn know him, the Beornings know him, the men of Eriador know him, the Dunlendings know him, Saruman knows him, Sauron obviously fears him. The elves know who he is. He really is the beacon of hope, if I could coin a DAC term. So he takes Gollum to Thranduil's halls, there he leaves him, and then he returns to Eriador. I believe the plan is that Gandalf will then go and interrogate Gollum, but of course things kick off before then. Gandalf, now very suspicious that the ring is the ring, before having even spoken with Gollum. We now come to the year 3018 of the Third Age, and this is when Frodo sets out on his quest from Crickhollow to Rivendell. And Gollum is never actually interrogated or spoken with. And indeed, Legolas, just as a minor side point, Legolas is only actually present at the Council of Elrond because he is there to tell them that they are sorry, but Gollum escaped. I don't know how Gollum escapes from an elven prison underground. I mean, come on. He is wily, and I get you that, but they're elven prisons. They can't be that easily broken out of. Anyway, he does. He escapes. And Legolas is actually at the council to tell them that. This is an interesting tidbit. But with Gandalf now very fearful that the ring is the ring, he gets Aragorn completely on board, and Aragorn returns to Eriador and then actively looks out for Frodo. Obviously, he comes upon him eventually in Bree. And then we come to what I'm going to just run through very, very quickly, but we come to what's known as the War Years, or the War of the Ring. And of course, many of you know exactly what happens to Aragorn in this time. So I'll just give you a very, very brief synopsis. There's very little different from the movie, to be fair. And indeed, obviously, if you've read the books. But so essentially, Aragorn escorts Frodo out of Bree. They are ambushed at the base of the Weathertop, not on top of it, as the film would have you believe, but at the base of it. But they do escape. Frodo obviously does get stabbed, but whilst in the wilderness, Glorfindel comes upon their party, not Arwen, and Frodo is sent off on Asphalloth alone. He doesn't have Glorfindel riding with him. So Frodo is sent off on Asphalloth, one of the greatest horses in Middle-earth. And Glorfindel then leads the others, Merry, Pippin, Sam and Aragorn, he leads them by a different route to Rivendell so that they will definitely avoid the Nazgul. And actually, interestingly, they arrive behind the Nazgul when the waters of the... that's so annoying. The Bruinen. When the waters of the Bruinen raise up and wash away the Nazgul, Glorfindel is actually standing on the other bank, and he's said to be radiant and glorious, like a sun shining from the banks of the river. It's very cool. But anyway, so Aragorn comes to Rivendell, and then the Fellowship, of course, departs. The major difference at this time from the film to the actual events, if you will, in inverted commas, is that Aragorn at no point denies his heritage. At no stage does he ever deny that he wants to be the king. He is fully accepting of being the king from his 20th year when he gets told that he is the heir to both thrones. There is no stage where he's ever like, I don't want that power, blah, 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 blah. So when they actually leave Rivendell, he has the Shards of Narsil as his weapon. He actually uses that broken bit of the sword as his weapon. But whilst in Rivendell at the council, it is then reforged into Andúril, Flame of the West. So it's not years later and then Elrond brings it to him to get him to actually finally save everyone. He actually leaves Rivendell with Andúril. Already accepting of who he is, of course, going to be. They pass through Moria, and then they pass through Lorien, very much the same as it happens throughout. They are attacked at Amunhen or San Gabir, or actually on the plain of... I should have written the thing down. There's a grassy plain on the banks of Nen Hithoil near Amunhen, and that's where the fighting actually takes place. Amunhen itself, the hill itself, doesn't necessarily factor into it. Anyway, they're attacked there, much of the same events. Boromir, of course, dies there, which is the saddest moment of the films. Brings a tear to my eye even now, and we're so many years on. Amazing moment. That's why I chose to have it as the image in the background there. And then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli go off following the orcs to hunt down Merry and Pippin, and Frodo and Sam go off on their own. This is where he meets Eomer, who has not been banished from Rohan, but is in fact actually just returning to Edoras on a normal scouting mission. He's not on his way running away or anything. And he meets Eomer, and they actually form quite a close bond, Eomer and Aragorn. They become fast friends, and that's shown a little later on. Of course, he then meets Gandalf, who is now Gandalf the White, not Gandalf the Grey. They meet in Fangorn Forest, much as they do in the film. They do actually try and kill Gandalf. They do think he is Saruman, and but they swiftly realise the error of their ways, and they all ride off together for Edoras, where they go with Theoden, who resolves that they should ride to war against Saruman. Or not necessarily against Saruman. Theoden, they just know that there is troubles on the western border of Rohan, so Theoden musters as many men as he can, and they ride west to counter it. It's not like a direct, let's go to war with Isengard. It's more of a, we're heading over there to defend ourselves, more in a very, very, very abridged version. And also, Wormtongue, whilst being a despicable advisor, Theoden's not like totally under the sway of Saruman. He is just tainted a little by Wormtongue's counsel. But they go to they ride west. They then retreat with what troops they can to Helm's Deep, and they fight at Helm's Deep. Major departure here. The elves do not go to Helm's Deep. That's the only real difference. They survive in Helm's Deep, and Gandalf, Erkenbrand, and Éomer are the three that ride to their aid. Sorry, not Éomer. Gandalf and Erkenbrand are the army that actually arrive to aid Helm's Deep. It is not Éomer. Éomer is in the city, in the fighting already. So that's another departure. But then they win, obviously, at Helm's Deep, and they ride directly to Isengard, where they parley with Saruman, as normal. But then this is where the biggest change comes. On their return from Isengard, the Grey Company arrive from the north. Now, the Grey Company is a small kind of battalion of just elite rangers who ride with Elladan and Elrohir, and of course Halbarad. If you don't know who Halbarad is, he is the banner carrier of the Dúnedain and close confidant of Aragorn. And so the Grey Company now arrives, and this is when Aragorn resolves that he should go for the Paths of the Dead, because a message has been sent with the Grey Company from Elrond telling him to go to the Paths of the Dead. So that bit is accurate, but it's just not Elrond himself. They also bring a present from Arwen, which is a banner which has the symbols of the High King of Gondor and Arnor on it, and that's very cool. So they go to the Paths of the Dead. Of course, the dead come on side. They destroy the black ships, or they don't destroy them. They kill the crewmen, and they rout the armies of Umbar that are coming by land as well, or the armies of Harad. And Aragorn then takes what men he can. The army of the dead is actually released by Aragorn as soon as the crew members of the black ships have been killed. The army of the dead does not go to Minas Tirith. It only goes as far as Pelargir. Or not, I don't even think Pelargir. I think literally the mouths of the Anduin, the Aethir Anduin. And Aragorn then lets the dead go, and he gathers what men he can from the south, which is a sizable number. They take the ships and they sail north. They come upon Minas Tirith, and they win the day, of course. It is then that they set out for the Black Gate, and there's a fight on the Slag Hills near the Black Gate, and of course then Sauron is defeated. So those are the war years. Very, very brief synopsis, and with minor changes laid out. Now, of course, he is then crowned. Again, contrary to the film, he's actually crowned outside of Minas Tirith. He resolves he doesn't want to go into the city until he is a king. He has already actually been into the city to heal Faramir and Éowyn and Merry, which is part of a prophecy that suggests that the hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and people come to think that he is the king, but he sneaks in and he sneaks out. And the banner of Prince Imrahil is also flown above Minas Tirith at this time, with people then very doubtful. They think the king has returned, but they see the steward's banner is of Dol Amroth. Anyway, so he sneaks out, but he's crowned outside of Minas Tirith, and he enters the city as its king. The tradition is that the previous king would give the crown to the new king, or the steward would give the crown to the new king in the event of death. But as he hasn't truly taken a steward yet, and as of course there is no previous king, Frodo is chosen as the crown bearer, and Gandalf is chosen to put the crown upon his head. Now, interesting little tidbit about the crown as well. King Earnor, who is the last king of Gondor before the stewardship, who rode off to Minas Morgul to meet the challenge of the Witch King and is never heard of again, he lays the crown of Gondor on top his father Eärnil's grave in the Houses of the Dead off the Rathdin and the Silent Street, where the crown then resides for 1,000 years. And if I'm then not mistaken, Faramir then is the first person to lay his hands upon the crown as he goes to retrieve it, to bring it for the crown, for the coronation. So it sits in a tomb for 1,000 years, or give or take, and then it's used for Aragorn's coronation, which I think is very cool. So he becomes the king. He takes Faramir as his steward, and he grants Faramir the title of Prince of Ithilien and Lord of Emun Arnon, which is the land to the east of the Anduin in Gondor, right next to Osgiliath. Shortly after becoming king as well, Gandalf leads Aragorn high up onto the slopes of Mount Mindalluin, which is the mountain behind Minas Tirith. And there they find a scion of Nimloth, which is the name of the white tree of Gondor. So the white tree doesn't actually reflower. The dead tree is the dead tree, but they find another white tree that was, I don't know, kept in secret or grown with the magic of the Valar, who knows. And that is up in the slopes of Mindalluin. So a new white tree is planted in the courtyard of the fountain, and they're signalling the heraldship of the king. Arwen and Elrond also then come to Minas Tirith shortly thereafter, after he is crowned, and Elrond presents to him the scepter of Annúminas, thus solidifying his claim to also the kingship of Arnor. Arwen, of course, and he are then married. They get married almost in the final year of the Third Age, the year 3019. And then we come on to Aragon in the Fourth Age, which again, I'm afraid, there is not much information on, and the only image I got for it was him dying, because it's kind of the main event. Spoiler alert. So, the only things that Aragorn does in his king, number one, he is listed as a great king, and he is said to bring peace and prosperity to all of Gondor. He returns the Orthanc stone to Isengard, and the first Elendilymir is found within Isengard. Saruman had taken the Elendilymir from the body of Isildur, and he'd taken it to Isengard. The Elendilymir is just a gem, a jewel that's laid on a I think it's a mithril, or it might just be silver or steel, and it's like it's almost like a headband, or a headband's probably the best description. And anyway, the original one is found in the dungeons of Isengard, and Aragorn uses that as a symbol of his power. It should be noted there was a second Elendilymir created when the first one was lost, and Aragorn, it is said, wears the replica on a daily basis, and he wears the original when he's acting in like high authority or on regal days or whatever, which is quite cool. He grants the Dúnedain forest to the Dúnedain, and they get to rule there as an autonomous realm, and he sets various protective laws, and he does the same for the Shire. So the Shire is extended, its borders are extended all the way to the Emun Baraid, which are the Tower Hills on the western edge of the Shire, and he grants them complete autonomy, and he even decrees that men are not allowed to enter except by leave of the hobbits. So he really does just isolate them massively, but then that's what they want. So he also decrees that the Thane of the Shire, the Mayor of Mitchell Delving, and the Master of Buckland be made council members of his Council of the North, which is the kind of ruling force that rules in the North, because he spends most of his time in the South, as tradition warranted. Although not necessarily, Elendil actually took his main capital in Annúminas, and that's where he tended to live, and he left Isildur he left Anarion in the south to rule Gondor. And Isildur did the same when he became High King. He went off to Arnor and ruled from there. But Aragorn swaps it and presumably spends most of his time in the south. We don't actually know. He might return to the north, but it's highly likely he lives most of his life in the south. He renews his Oath of Eorl, or he renews the Oath of Eorl with Éomer, the now King Éomer of the Riddermark. And the two become, as I say, very close friends and advisors, and the two nations become even closer than they were before. And finally, of course, he founds the House of Tel Cantar. Now, Tel Cantar is a Quenya word, and it is apparently the translation of Strider into Quenya, or approximation of it. He has a son, as many of you will know, called Eldarion, and he has various daughters who Tolkien never gave names to. And his lineage is protected. And then finally, in the 120th year of the Fourth Age, when Aragorn is 210 years old, he dies. And again, another little change from the film. Arwen actually dies only the following year. She doesn't wait hundreds of years wandering on her own, as Elrond cautions her that she might. She only actually lives 1 year before she too also dies. And two of them are buried together, as I say, in the Houses of the Dead, which is off of a street in Gondor called the Rath Denen, or in Minas Tirith, sorry. I hate it when people think Minas Tirith is a country and Gondor is a city. Anyway, the Rath Dúnedain is a famous street behind the Great Palace, and that image actually does a very good depiction of it, because you can see in the centre of the image, you can see the White Tower of Icthelion and the Palace of Gondor, and the Rath Dúnedain comes away from behind that and leads up onto the slopes of Mount Mindalluin, and off of that path, that street, all of the houses of the dead and the kings are buried. Rath Dúnedain means silent street. I believe I may have said that already, I apologise. So Aragorn obviously passes and his son rules. Now Aragorn lives to 210, and as I say, that's kind of a little peak in an otherwise pattern of decline. The Númenóreans originally lived for a considerable number of years. I think something like 400 odd years in the beginning, maybe even 600 years originally, and it slowly declines all the way down. But Aragorn is, as I say, he's a peak. He's an anomaly. Most of the Dúnedain live to 150, and even then it's decreasing. As I say, Gilraen dies when she's 100, but Aragorn lives to 210, but that is very rare. And it's said to be a mark of just how he is almost Elendil reborn. He is a great figure in Gondor. But that kind of concludes his tale, obviously, because he's dead, so he can't do anything anymore. But there are two little tidbits I wanted to add that we don't have direct dates for. The first is that Aragorn actually passes through Moria himself. So in the Fellowship of the Ring, they go through Moria, and it's very much suggested that Gandalf is the only one that knows the way, and it's been years since he went through it. But Aragorn actually passes through Moria himself at a time. We don't know when, we don't know what age, don't know at which point of his travels this might have taken place, but it means that he's familiar with Moria, at least to a degree. And that's an interesting point. And the second point, which isn't necessarily related to Aragorn directly, but I always think it's very touching, and it's one of those cool things I wish the film did touch upon. But Merry and Pippin are come to become quite famous in Gondor, and when they die, when Aragorn dies, the bodies of Merry and Pippin are actually buried next to him. They're moved next to him, which I think is really cool. Obviously, Merry has an awful lot to do with Rohan and frequently revisits, and Pippin has a lot to do with Gondor, and they both frequently revisit. But when both of them are quite old, they move to Minas Tirith together. They leave the Shire together, and they spend the last years of their life in Gondor. And then, obviously, they die and they're buried in the houses of the dead, which is a great honour in of itself. But then when Aragorn dies, their bodies are moved next to him. And I just think that is that's such a cool little touch, isn't it? So the Fellowship, the most of the members of the Fellowship that remain are all buried together in Minas Tirith. I think that's cool. But that concludes the lore video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. It isn't obviously as in-depth as humanly possible. There are attempts at being sort of brief roundups of information. But feel free to question, comment, and do as you will. I wrote it on Word this time and printed it out. It was 10 times easier. Anyway, so I do hope you've enjoyed it, and until we speak again, dear friends, I don't know who will be the next character bio, and I don't know when the next bio will be, but I've enjoyed this, and I probably will go through the members of the Fellowship, if I'm honest, because they interest me the most. But until we speak again, Navar na den Pedimad Melonin, and farewell.